Executive Director of AIA Potomac Valley, and we're really pleased to have you here today. We are especially pleased to be offering this webinar because it is one that has had tremendous registration and is clearly something that people are quite interested in. So we're going to go ahead and dive into it. Before we get started, I wanted to just mention a couple of things. One, just to underline the level of interest in this subject, wanted to say that out of all the webinars we have given, this is in the top 5 in terms of the number of people who registered for it. So again, just great topic. I really want to thank Willdan and Potomac Edison for providing us with such an exciting, compelling program. And I also want to thank them so very much for their strong support of AIA Potomac Valley. They're a silver sponsor. They have been a vibrant part of our AIA PV community for several years. We are so grateful for that, and we're especially happy that they can be delivering such a program that has generated so much interest. So with that, I'd like to introduce Amy Lohman, who is Potomac Edison's Commercial and Industrial Energy Efficiency Program Manager. And Amy is going to start our program. So Amy, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Sue. Thanks everyone for joining today. As she mentioned, I'm the CNI program manager. I'm located in Hagerstown, Maryland. Do you guys want to go to the next slide just so I can talk about the programs? I think there was a list of programs there we offer. Yeah. So as you can see here on the first slide, we do have many programs to offer to fit our customers' needs. Katie, who's the project manager for the commercial new construction program, is going to be talking mostly about that today. But if you have any other questions about any of the programs listed here, you can feel free to reach out to me or their team, and they'll get you in contact with me or someone in that program that can assist you. So with that, I'll turn it over to Katie to go over the commercial new construction program, which is most relevant to the design teams and architect firms.
All right. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Sue. Hey, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here. I'm a project manager from Willdan, and I want to introduce my colleague and fabulous co-presenter, Annie Hu, also from Willdan, and Annie is an energy specialist. All right, so to tell you more details about the Commercial New Construction Program, also known as CNC, really our intent is to provide assistance to customers in Potomac Edison's territory, provide assistance to architects, engineers, while projects are still in the design phase. Essentially, while there's still time to consider different energy efficiency strategies that could be incorporated into your project scope. So we provide this assistance through our complementary energy modeling services, and the model will show a range of energy savings opportunities as well as a range of energy incentives for the customer. These energy incentives can help reduce the costs of implementing strategies that go beyond the energy code. And by participating in the program, customers and design teams will have access to our dedicated consulting engineers. So in terms of eligibility for the Commercial New Construction Program, projects would need to be in Potomac Edison service territory. We accept commercial projects that are either new construction, undergoing major renovations, or additions that are at least 5,000 square feet. Participants do need to have an interest in evaluating the energy efficiency potential for their project. And while projects do need to be in design to enroll, we will accept projects that still haven't completed their HVAC construction documents as well. And also want to point out that there's no cost to participate in the CNC program, and that energy incentives are available to both the customer and to design teams. All right, so now we'll begin the course content of the nuance of net zero and why it's not enough. This course has been approved by AIA for 1 LUHSW. And after course completion, reporting for AIA members will be provided along with a CE certificate for those that have requested one. And this course has also been approved by GBCI for 1 general CE hour. Also, upon course completion, you will receive a certificate for self-reporting to GBCI. All right, so listed here is the agenda that we've set out for you today. First, we'll give some background details of the Evolving Electric Grid Challenge, and then we'll dive into the ways that we can meet this grid challenge by first talking about some non-building solutions and options in balancing the grid. And then we'll turn our attention to how buildings can become a key part of the solution. And we'll discuss ways that we can enable our buildings in becoming more grid responsive and essentially better grid citizens. And then we'll wrap things up with some key takeaways. And then if you can please hold your questions until the end of the presentation, we'll be happy to discuss your questions. And if you want to put a question in the chat while you're thinking of it, you can do that as well, and we will address it at the end of the presentation. So with that, I will hand things over to Annie.
Thanks, Katie. So first, we are going to dive right into the Electric Grid Challenge. To put this presentation into perspective, we're going to ask you all to kind of think about the energy you use every day. So your smartphone, laptop, even the lights that are powering your room at this very moment. When we use these things, the amount of electricity being consumed needs to be nearly exactly balanced with the amount of electricity being generated. Otherwise, we get voltage fluctuations that damage the equipment and cause blackouts. Independent system operators, or ISOs, are actually in charge of this balancing act, and they maintain giant control rooms that monitor the voltage on the grid. They bring generation up or down to match the load and keep the voltage at the right level. And those are called spinning reserves, and they're typically fueled by natural gas because it can ramp generation up and down very quickly. So the conventional energy grid until recently consisted of fossil fuels, hydro, and nuclear power plants that generated electricity, transmitted it to the area where it was needed, and then distributed it to individual buildings. The transmission could flow in either direction, but distribution almost always went in one direction. But the current energy grid has seen a huge drop in the price of wind, solar, and storage, as well as a substantial increase in the electrification of heating and transportation. And these trends have impacts on our grid that we normally don't even think about on the daily. So essentially, the grid of 2030 is going to be drastically different than the grid we've had the last 100+ years. First of all, electricity production is increasingly distributed and it varies based on the weather. So in most cases today, it is cheaper to build new wind or solar than it is to pay for even just the fuel of existing coal or natural gas power plants. Additionally, distributed generation and storage means electricity is flowing in multiple directions. So if a building owner installs solar panels on their roof, they can opt to sell their renewable energy back to the grid. And in many cases, those buildings with their own renewables aren't fully powered by their own sources. So the flow of electricity goes both ways. And when we take a look at solar specifically, solar is actually changing the load shape that grid operators are seeing. So in California, solar is now mandated in new residential buildings, and high electricity prices and the frequency of sunny days make solar a really cost-effective investment. And because of this, grid operators are seeing a huge change in the midday net demand of solar, and that shape is often called the duck curve. Here's a little duck in case you needed a reminder of what those look like, but you can see at the tail and the head, that's when the net load is the highest. So as the sun begins to come up, you have a lot of supply to meet the demand, and that net load goes down. But the solar output begins to drop right before the peak load of the day, around 6 p.m., and that creates a high net load where the energy demand far exceeds supply. So currently, the excess demand is met mostly with natural gas power plants, and that shows that the variability of solar needs to be balanced with flexible demand services. And although this trend is most dramatic in California, continued adoption of cheaper solar power will eventually bring it to a grid near you. But unfortunately, ducks are not the only grid shape we need to worry about, sadly. In the Midwest, we have higher wind speeds that have led to a different kind of load shape. Fresh Energy, which is a nonprofit advocating for renewable energy and decarbonization, has dubbed the Midwest Independent System Operator, or MISO's, load shape the Smiling Gator. Looking at the graph on the left without that lovely smiling gator, we see that the wind speed varies across the day, but is typically stronger at night. So as wind generation increases, we see overproduction during the early morning hours when energy demand is lowest. And wind generation can also change rapidly with weather fronts. The graph looking at the right shows the MISO North loads in May of 2017. So energy demand is in blue, wind supply in yellow, and net load in gray. At 6 p.m., a weather front came through and wind generation dropped 8,000 megawatts, bounced back 4,000 as the next front came through, and then it fell again. So that type of event will give the ISO whiplash as they try to balance load and generation. And you can see that reflected in the gray, that net load.
I got whiplash just looking at that. All right, so let's take a look at the RFC West eGrid subregion that Western Maryland is a part of. We can see that energy production is primarily coal, nuclear, and gas, and only 7% of renewables are making up the RFC West energy generation. In 2020, Maryland's overall non-renewable energy production was mostly from nuclear and gas at 79%, and then with some coal. And then renewables fueled about 11% of energy consumption, with 4% coming from hydroelectricity. Maryland's goal by 2030 is to have 50% of energy supplied by renewable sources as required by the Renewable Energy Portfolio Standard. And furthermore, by 2040, Maryland's goal is to have 100% clean electricity as proposed in the Clean and Renewable Energy Standard. With the unprecedented electric demand from transportation, heating, and other end uses, this has brought new opportunities and challenges. As shown here in the graph from the PJM Independent System Operator that Maryland is a part of, electrification will shift the time of PJM's greatest electricity demand from summer to winter. So shown in blue, the winter net hourly profile has a slightly higher but substantially wider peak demand than that of summer, which is shown in the black there. And so the shift in load patterns due to the electrification suggests opportunities for adopting flexible generation strategies. And so the grid of the future will need to be more extensive and more dynamic than ever before. And sometimes we may hear that we should wait to electrify until after we have fully decarbonized the grid. But even with today's grid, for example, this map is showing how heat pumps are dramatically reducing carbon emissions across the landscape as compared to heating that's sourced by natural gas and fuel oil. So you can think of this similarly with electric vehicles because of the high efficiency of electric motors compared to internal combustion engines. An electric car today produces significantly less carbon per mile, even if powered by a fossil fuel grid. So as the grid continues to get cleaner, the benefits will also improve over time. But as I mentioned in the last slide, this will produce a shift from a summer peak to that winter peak. With 2021 gas and electric rates, the average home in Maryland could save approximately $100 per year to electrify with heat pumps. Those savings would be even higher with the current 30% increase in gas costs. And so as more consumers are leaving the gas system, fewer consumers are left to pay for the gas system costs, which is why the Building Energy Transition Plan by the Maryland Commission on Climate Change recommends transitioning 100% of low-income households to heat pumps by 2030, so that we're reducing the energy burden for the most vulnerable Marylanders. And when it comes to commercial buildings, these will typically cost less to operate with heat pumps than with natural gas. Of course, keeping in mind that costs will vary based on the building's internal loads. And by electrifying, there's the added benefit of the first cost savings by not installing a second fuel meter and piping to distribute the gas. All right, so here we're taking a look at a graph provided by Willdan's Energy and Environmental Economics Division, also known as E3, and they provided policy analysis for the E21 initiative in Minnesota. So we found that under optimistic technology and energy efficiency assumptions, electrification of all natural gas buildings in Minnesota would more than double electric peak demands as shown in the yellow. However, that increase could be cut in half with a hybrid approach shown in the blue if we were to electrify and keep natural gas infrastructure for backup heating. We do want to point out that significant winter peaks are also found in the Pacific Northwest, New England, and also here in Maryland. All these factors mean things are getting much more complicated for independent system operators. They continually need to balance system loads and generation in a system with many more variables. Their old methods of maintaining that balance is already showing signs of being insufficient. You know, if you think back in 2021 with the Texas deep freeze, when the cold drop in temperatures caused all those folks to turn up their thermostats at the same time, the sudden surge in demand for electricity caused the supply to be quickly depleted. So with that, we are really in need of new solutions to prevent these blackouts from occurring. And so I will pass it back to Annie, who will walk us through some potential grid-wide solutions.
Yep, thanks, Katie. So we're going to start tying things together by hopefully discussing what we think could be some solutions to these challenges. And we'll first take a look at some of those larger scale solutions before narrowing the focus to building level strategies. So here we have the grid balancing toolkit, and these strategies here are ways to hopefully mitigate the increased volatility of a more distributed and renewable grid. So first up is increased distribution. If we have more interconnection between different regions of the US, we can average out varied weather conditions and transfer the extra supply from one area to another. But distribution is expensive, and it often takes 10 years or longer to get permitted and built. Another option would be to build more natural gas peaking plants. And you can think of peaking plants as a backup generation source when demand gets really high. System modeling done by Willdan's E3 division has found that the lowest cost electric system to build and operate in nearly all parts of the nation is a system with 80% renewable energy and 20% natural gas, which is used to make up for the variability. A third solution is increased storage. So utility scale storage can be added to solar and substation systems. That way solar energy can be stored when there's more of it than we need and discharged when the grid is short of energy. And that type of solution has been used by Conexus Energy in Minnesota to provide electricity that's renewable and costs 20% less than the energy purchased from other generators. Alternatively, storage can also be aggregated across a large number of customers and operated as one large virtual battery. The fourth tool in the grid balancing toolkit is overproduction, and basically overproduction of inexpensive wind and solar can cost effectively meet peak loads. So during hours when demand is lower, production can be curtailed or used for other productive means like recharging batteries or hydrolysis to generate green hydrogen. However, all of these options do have capital costs. So we should first focus on enabling our buildings to be grid responsive, and that will ultimately take less infrastructure and cost to meet the needs of the grid. And it often requires only some different control sequences and a signal from the utility. And that will segue into how buildings can be a key part of the solution to the grid challenges. The answer needs to be a lot more nuanced than just making every building net zero. So as we've discussed, the grid needs to be balanced all the time, every day. And if every building is a net generator of electricity during the day and a net consumer at night, like nearly all net zero buildings are, who's going to provide that energy during the day and who's going to provide it back at night? We can't build a battery large enough for that, and it wouldn't be cost effective. So you can think of it like this. Net zero, without considering holistic grid impacts, is kind of like growing an all organic, pesticide-free garden full of all this great, fresh, healthy produce. But then you go out to ice cream and eat ice cream instead of eating your veggies. So you can congratulate yourself all you want for adding more healthy food and clean energy to the world. But if it's not what you're consuming, it doesn't really help your health or reduce your environmental impacts. So let's focus on efficiency first. If you reduce the amount of energy a building consumes, you'll also decrease the capital costs needed to reach net zero. You will minimize the amount of grid infrastructure needed by reducing the energy flow into and out of the building. And you'll also improve occupant comfort. So one example of that is improving the insulation so the HVAC doesn't have to work as hard to heat or cool the space. And it also increases the comfort level for users. However, efficiency has lengthening paybacks the further you go, as well as technical barriers to achieving 100% efficiency, which is essentially impossible. On the other hand, solar has shortening paybacks the more you install, so there's an optimal trade-off for each building. Our analysis does show that the sweet spot typically occurs when the design efficiency is 50 to 60% better than code, but as code becomes more stringent and solar less expensive, that sweet spot will shift. All right, so let's get into the weeds of this presentation. Hold on as we dive deeper into some of these costs. Every year here, the consulting firm Lazard does an estimate of the levelized unsubsidized cost of the different forms of energy generation. And levelized costs basically include the expenses needed to build, fuel, and maintain a system in relation to how much energy it produces. So essentially, it's a way to compare the cost of different technologies with different characteristics, such as lifespan and project size, and it allows conventional systems to be compared to renewable ones. And the bars here are the cost ranges per megawatt hour for different technologies. The orange diamonds are the ongoing costs, such as site restoration costs after an asset has been fully depreciated. So for conventional systems, the cheapest option is a natural gas combined cycle, which is the most common type of natural gas powered system. For renewables, the cheapest options are utility scale solar and wind. And Lazard doesn't include energy efficiency in their analysis, but Willdan's calculations show that energy efficiency measures can cost as low as $15 per megawatt hour. The point here is that we should try to meet our energy needs at the lowest total cost in carbon. We should buy all of that $15 per megawatt hour efficiency that we can, but then as levelized costs get higher, we should buy wind and solar. Those investments minimize both capital costs and carbon emissions. Another point here is that gas peaking plants, or those backup generation plants we mentioned before, are a more expensive option per megawatt hour that they provide. But for now, they're still sometimes the least expensive way to meet peak demand hours and should more appropriately be compared to storage if they're only going to be operated for a few hours a day. Decarbonization is going to require a lot of investment, but that investment will save us a tremendous amount of energy costs and environmental catastrophe in the long run. So when a project and team considers renewables and efficiency measures, the first thing they're going to see is those larger upfront costs. But what they need to realize is that renewables and efficiency measures are also going to have significantly lower ongoing costs than conventional approaches. And that's what makes them viable and necessary to our buildings. So one of my favorite quotes from a seminar I listened to recently was by Lori Kerr, climate advisor for the USGBC, and she says, build it right the first time. Otherwise, it's going to cost you a lot more to replace it all down the line.
Right. Thanks, Annie. I like that quote. Speaking of sayings, here's another one that we'd like to share with you. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So this saying helps reframe how we can think about buildings being a part of the solution to the electric grid challenge, since the answer needs to be more nuanced than just making every building net zero. Net zero buildings rely on the grid to act as a battery for it, and that can work great if it's just a few buildings here and there. It can allow you to act fast, but if the only strategy is to get every building to be net zero, this approach will break down and won't allow us to go very far together. So our team at Willdan, we're committed to the vision of decarbonizing our economy, including our built environment, but we need to do this collectively and by working together. So unless you are designing your building to be off-grid, your building is still going to be a part of that broader energy infrastructure, and we need to consider how all those pieces will interact. That way we can work together to find the lowest cost and fastest way to get ourselves to decarbonization. Essentially, we need to design our buildings with the eye towards the grid, particularly the infrastructure needs to meet the peak demands and the varying carbon emissions intensity over the course of the year. The electric grid is designed to meet a peak load with a safety factor. In this graph, we are showing Maryland's projected grid demand in megawatts for every hour of the year, shown in green. For carbon intensity, you can see in yellow the varying levels for every hour across the year here. The peak load is currently projected in the afternoons of June and July for most areas. So the less demand that our buildings add during those times, the less grid upgrades we would need to make to serve those. So we can see here that the demand is fairly predictable, largely driven by temperature and its related cooling loads. In terms of carbon intensity, Maryland isn't really showing much of a seasonal variation. And so for both demand and carbon intensity, if we build in some flexibility and automated demand response in our buildings, we could shed load when it has the biggest impact. And this can be done without, much notice by the occupants. So we listed some strategies example here. So you could dim the lights, 10 to 20%. You could pre-cool a space with solar energy while the sun is still shining. There's relaxing thermal set points when the sun or wind generates less energy. And then there's adjusting the temperature of service hot water tanks. All right, so here we've zoomed in to that third week of July in Maryland, where the week has the highest projected demand. So if we were to shed the load for a few hours on Tuesday and Wednesday, we could reduce the total capacity of the transmission and distribution system investments by 5%. And given that distribution projects often cost billions of dollars, this could drive real savings in the amount of infrastructure that we would need. Demand response also provides defense against increased peaks caused by heat waves and climate change. And here we are showing a gripping example of the importance of having automated demand response in place. So here we're taking a look at the energy demand in California and how in early September 2022, when the demand was at an all-time high and it took a text message from the governor of California to save the electric grid. This is pretty gripping stuff here. So as temperatures reached record levels across the state, and solar production began to drop, Cal ISOA called it a demand response event, but there was not enough flexible load enrolled. So a little less than 2 hours later, the governor's office sent a text message to every mobile device saying, please conserve your energy. And the state asked that to everybody, conserve your energy for the next several hours. And with that, the response was pretty remarkable. Just within a few minutes, the state's demand reduced by 3,000 megawatts. Okay, so a more robust automated demand response program would have gotten the same effect, although with less impact on so many individuals and less nail biting on the part of the independent system operator. All right, so let's talk about the 4 S's and ways we can all move together towards a cleaner grid. So we got shape, shift, shed, and shimmy. Load shape is, there we go. Load shape is reshaping the customer's load profiles with advanced notice, maybe months or a month or days in advance. An example includes programming your heat pump water heaters to preheat domestic water ahead of time. Next, we have load shift. This is moving energy from high demand to times with surplus renewable energy. So you could begin to pre-cool a space while the sun is still shining instead of cranking up that AC when you get home after work at 6 or 7 p.m. in the summer months. With load shedding, this is load curtailment to control peak, such as dimming lights or relaxing thermal set points, or by utilizing energy storage, such as an on-site battery storage systems. And finally, shimmy, these are slight changes to reduce peak demand, such as delaying when an HVAC system would start, maybe like 15 minutes or so. That way your system isn't turning on at the same time as your neighbor's system.
In addition, there are now initiatives such as Grid Optimal, and that's an effort led by the New Buildings Institute that develop metrics for buildings to evaluate how they contribute to solving or worsening our grid challenges. So Grid Optimal uses demand forecast and carbon forecast scenarios from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory to calculate 8 building metrics, which we'll get into in the following slides. But on this screen, you can see some of the typical inputs such as building demand, flexibility, and all of those on the screen would go into the tool. So those factors help determine a building's impact on the grid. So getting into these 8 grid optimal metrics, the first 4 include grid peak contribution. So that's how much the building will demand from the grid during peak hours. We have on-site renewable utilization efficiency, and that's how much renewable energy is generated and used on-site. We have grid carbon alignment, and that is how much the building's demand contributes to the grid's carbon emissions. And then we have energy efficiency over the baseline, and that's how much energy the building saves when compared to a code baseline. The next 4 metrics include short-term demand flexibility, which is the amount of energy usage able to be shed over a period of 1 hour. Long-term demand flexibility, which is the same metric, but looking at a period of 4 hours. Then we have dispatchable flexibility, and that's the ability of a building to quickly respond to a high demand event if necessary. So if you think back to Katie's California text message example, dispatchable flexibility would have really helped in that situation. And then finally, we have resiliency, and that's the building's ability to build redundancy to the grid in case of critical events. Now let's start to translate these grid optimal metrics to an example. These graphs are showing peak demand in the summer and winter for a 100,000 square foot building that is fully electrified using a variable refrigerant flow or VRF system. And you can see that the peak has shifted from the summer afternoon as expected to a winter morning peak that is nearly twice as high. And in residential buildings, we've actually seen this increase become nearly 3 times as high. But energy efficiency measures, such as more efficient compressors, increased insulation, and a tighter thermal envelope can help bring that peak down. And in this example, energy efficiency measures help bring the peak demand below the baseline summer peak. It shows that energy efficiency measures are an extremely helpful tool as we build the renewable grid we need to keep climate change in check. And the shaded areas on these graphs here indicate the time of highest demand during peak days, which would also be the times of day when demand flexibility would help reduce grid load the most. So as Grid Optimal defines it, the darker shaded areas are times when short-term demand flexibility is needed, and the lighter areas indicate when long-term demand flexibility is needed. So not all the utilities offer demand response programs yet, but as generation becomes more variable, with the addition of renewables, we expect to see more of them. And currently, load flexibility is focused largely on grid demand, but it could also be in response to carbon signals. Now, if we take a look at the same building and include solar, we can see an example of how installing renewables isn't really a cure-all to our grid problems. Here we're looking at a simulated July 4th weekend where the building exports 300 kilowatts of solar energy on a sunny Tuesday afternoon. But let's say the next day on Wednesday, July 5th, the weather turns cloudy, and that would cause the building to import 200 kilowatts of grid energy. And that causes a swing of 500 kilowatts in just 24 hours, which creates difficulties for the grid as it tries to balance supply and demand. If other buildings in the neighborhood also depend on the same resources and experience the same weather, then the grid is going to experience an even larger swing. And that demonstrates a need for buildings to be able to use or store the energy they generate, contributing to a building's on-site renewable utilization efficiency.
So let's talk about some other strategies that our buildings can implement in order to help promote more grid-sensitive designs. Instead of focusing on midday solar generation, we could consider facing solar panels towards the west in order to provide late afternoon generation. And by doing so, this would help offset natural gas peaking plants. We could also incorporate automated demand response in the HVAC, lighting, and service hot water. And up next, we could use energy when renewable is available. So in the case of solar, you could preheat hot water to a higher temperature and then mix it back down to 120 degrees. And then rather than waiting until people get home at 6 or 7, you could consider pre-cooling apartments in the mid-afternoon instead. There are strategies to implement and to help minimize the winter peak demand, which I'll talk in more detail in the next slide. But up next, we want to mention that designing buildings to have more efficient shells. This can really help buildings coast through demand response events. So this image on the right that we have on the screen here is showing a neat example of this. It's showing the Icebox Challenge that was held in LA and in Seattle, and they built 2 types of building shells. One was at code level, and the other one was a passive house shell that had 500 pounds of ice. So after 7 days in the LA sun, the passive house was at 70 degrees and the Tidal 24 box was at 92 degrees, which is, oh my gosh, so hot. So obviously the passive house shell would allow for much more demand flexibility in heating and cooling loads, as well as reducing the overall energy consumption. But as mentioned earlier, everything does have trade-offs, and that passive survivability does need to be weighed against more energy generation. So in terms of minimizing winter peaks, here are some strategies that we can consider. With ground-coupled water source heat pumps, we can take advantage of the relatively stable underground temperatures to help heat and cool a building more efficiently year-round. And especially in colder climates, ground coupling has been found to be more effective than air source heat pumps. Although there are large upfront costs due to the drilling of geothermal wells, and the local geology of the building site does need to be conducive for this technology. Battery storage. So this plays a key role in ensuring that our buildings can still be powered by renewables, even when the sun isn't shining or when the wind has stopped blowing. So with battery storage, this will store the renewable energy and then release it when the power is needed the most, such as during times of peak demand in the winter. This will help keep costs down and electricity still flowing. With thermal storage, so this is a technology that stores heat for later use. This is another alternative that can help meet the challenges of winter peak and grid stability. So with thermal storage, this can take many forms. One example includes, using a storage tank for an electric heating system to enable off-peak power use. So this will help shed and shift building loads while also increasing energy savings. Yes, so improving the building envelope with measures that reduce air leakage, like added insulation and air sealing. This can help reduce the thermal demand and total energy needed to heat and cool a space. So in cases of demand response events, improved thermal envelopes may also improve occupant comfort, as we talked about in our last slide with the Icebox Challenge. And by using gas backup with air source heat pumps as an example, this is a helpful approach in lowering the winter demand as well, since gas heating, like direct fired gas furnaces, can heat up a space very quickly. This will make up for the inefficiencies of the air source heat pumps during the lowest temperature days and nights of the winter months. Well, so in terms of policy strategies, efficiency programs will need to be expand more in order to incorporate grid optimization. For instance, California has been a leading example with the time-dependent valuation approach to code compliance. So as we're drawing to a close, we wanted to leave you some key takeaways and concepts here. So as we discussed, setting a goal and just becoming net zero isn't going to be enough. Today, we're facing challenges in balancing the grid with the increase of variable energy generation, distributed energy, and more extreme weather events. yes, decarbonization is going to require a lot of investment, but that investment will save us a tremendous amount of energy costs and environmental catastrophe in the long run. Renewables and energy efficiency measures have significantly lower ongoing costs than conventional approaches, which is what makes them viable and necessary to our buildings. So by working together and designing our buildings that focus on grid interactions, energy efficiency, and the capacity for demand flexibility, this will help minimize winter peak demand. And there are modeling tools out there available to help us find the right technologies and approaches for our buildings, so we can work together towards decarbonization and stabilizing the grid. And with that, this concludes the presentation. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Quite a turnout. We're happy to address any questions that you might have for me and Annie or Amy about the presentation, or if you have any questions about our energy modeling services through Potomac Edison's commercial new construction program, we're happy to address those at this time now. So, and of course, if you want to contact us later on, here is our emails on the screen here, and we can certainly talk offline about your projects or whatever questions you have for us. So and I'm looking at the chat. Oh, thank you, Lauren. You said what a great presentation. Wow. Thank you so much. I'm going to do a wow emoji. Or maybe a clapping hands. Thank you. Appreciate that feedback.
Oh,
See
I'm
'em.
seeing some questions in the chat starting to pop up.
Yeah, same here. Let's see. John Corkill said the Maryland legislature is better at demanding carbon zero than preparing citizens for blackouts, since the legislators have not seen. Oh, I think maybe your question or comment got cut off, John, there. Let's see. Oh, the Maryland legislation should see this presentation. Wow. I'd be happy. We're available. We love that. What great feedback. Thank you, John. Oh, I see, Lauren, you said, do you have any recommendations for literature or websites for more information? Oh, that's a good question.
We did do quite a bit of, we do have resources here. I think, Katie, you've done more with the Maryland side of things. I think you might have some of those Maryland specific resources.
Yeah, I looked into the Maryland Department of Energy, and so last year they passed the Climate Solutions Now Act, and they're currently drafting a new plan of how to, because the idea is that we're trying to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 60% as compared to 2006 levels, and we're trying to achieve this target in 8 years in 2031. So I have not read with what they said. It's like 100 pages or so, but next month they are going to their plan is going to be released to the public and open for comment, and that plan will be finalized at the end of this year. So if you go to the Maryland Department of Environment site or the Maryland Commission on Climate Change, they're open to feedback from folks. So I myself am interested to see what more details are in that
Right.
scope.
Some other things I'm thinking too are that Grid Optimal initiative that we mentioned.
Yeah.
I know their website has a bunch of different tools that are really worth looking at, and those, they include a bunch of spreadsheets and calculators, if those are things that you guys are looking for your projects, that's a great one to look at. There's also, I had on my mind, we kind of briefly mentioned it, but California's time-dependent valuation, that's another kind of code program that is it's similar to Grid Optimal, but I think it focuses more on costs. So that could be another tool for projects as moving forward in this path.
Yeah, thank you, Annie. Those great recommendations. Did that one slide of the Grid Optimal have, there wasn't a link to that, right? But I'll put it in the chat for people.
Yep, that would help. I am seeing a private message from Gary saying, can you talk more about how renewables have lower ongoing costs? Right, so essentially what we found is that fossil fuels are costing more to continue to fuel them. So like extracting that natural gas, extracting that coal, etc. As we've gone down, I think there's a bunch of great research done by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory on how the price of solars, the price of wind turbines have gone down drastically over the past, it must be like 5 or 10 years. But again, we were showing that Lazard chart, but per megawatt hour, they are quite a bit cheaper than some of those fossil fuel resources. Hope that answers your question.
Let's see, there's other questions here from Al. Any ideas for solar PV at utility scale that doesn't involve the compromise of urban open space or agricultural land? Huh. I don't have any ideas at this time.
That is a good question.
Yeah.
I can speak to that one. I believe, I don't know where this initiative is at now, but at some point, the US government had been looking at developing large swaths of desert land for solar. I know in other countries they've done this too. I think in China there's a very large amount of desert space that is used for solars. I think there might be some place in the, I want to say the Mid East that has a similar area as well, but that could be a case. Like we were saying, distribution. So distributed sources having a huge, I guess, solar or wind plant somewhere and being able to connect that across different places of the US is kind of possibly one solution to the issue that you've presented there. It definitely is a little bit difficult looking at urban landscapes or agricultural land, but that might be one solution there. Katie, anything to add on that one?
Not for me. I did see a comment from John Corkill about covering warehouse roofs with solar panels here in the east where electricity is needed. So yes, yeah, it's a good suggestion.
And Katie and Annie, I'm going to jump in. Did you all address the question from Will? It's if you scroll up, it's above Gary's question. I'm not sure if you.
Oh, great, thank you.
Got that one. Yep.
Yeah, thanks, Sue. Let's see.
Oh,
go ahead.
Do you have any recommendations for incorporating building automation systems into utility demand management? Sorry, digesting this question for a second.
Right.
That is a good question, and that is something we look at in our energy modeling. Building automation systems. Something that we take a look at is, for example, networked lighting, and that is something that can be controlled by building automation systems, dimming your lights down to, or keeping your maximum lighting output at a cap, basically, and so you're not going full design when you don't need to. Those can also be used for HVAC. utility demand management. I believe for residential systems as well, one thing they do is ask customers or residential customers to only run their HVAC for 20 minutes out of an hour or something similar to that. And that could be another strategy. Hopefully that, not quite sure I've answered that fully, but
No, that's good. I'm curious. I don't want to put Amy on the spot. I see you're still on. Is there demand management, or sorry, demand response type programs available through the First Energy offering?
Currently, there's not, Katie.
Gotcha. Okay. Scrolling through to see if there's other comments that I missed.
Keep that then. As well.
I'm sorry, Han. What were you saying? I
Oh,
didn't.
I'm just saying that I think we got all the questions. I
Okay.
track of the ones you answered. And
Okay. All right.
with Sue's help with Will's question, I think we answered them. You answered them all. If there's any other thoughts or comments.
I'm actually seeing a private message from, I think, Al. If there's a way to justify the cost, does it make sense to install solar PV systems on individual residences? I believe so. I know there are a lot of incentive programs to install PV on residences. That is definitely something that's very local and something you'd have to check with like your local government, local businesses as well to see how much they can incentivize you for that. And many of those services will also tell you what your payback is looking for. I know one of the issues with residential PV at least is, you know, a house isn't forever for some people. So you might have to sell that house eventually. And what if you haven't paid off that solar mortgage yet? It makes it a little bit difficult to sell the house. So that is one of the barriers. But I think with governmental incentives and some of those other things that we talked about, such as community PV, on-site storage, and demand response programs, those can help to balance specifically residential solar PV.
Are there any other questions or comments for us? I know we're maybe 5 minutes till the end, so.
Yep, Lauren pointed out tax credits. That's a thing as well for solar panels.
And if anyone wants to unmute and ask a question verbally, please feel free if you prefer that to the chat.
Well, I, for my part, I would like to have each and every one of our legislators somehow be forced to watch this presentation because they seem to be good at demanding something, but they don't seem to realize how complex the whole situation is. That the grid is going to become an increasingly difficult thing to manage once we do all of the things we must do to keep up with the legislation. And I think the legislators who legislate this stuff need to be better acquainted with some of those subtleties.
That's well said, John.
Do we have any other comments or questions?
Looks like the chat is pretty quiet, Sue.
Yeah, I think we have just about exhausted people's questions. Let's give it just a couple seconds more, but I believe we are just about done and almost exactly, on the hour. So great timing from everyone. One last call for anyone who may have a final question or comment. Okay, I think we are ready to complete this webinar. I want to thank once again Willdan for this great presentation, incredibly useful information. And as you've heard, we have several people who would really like to get this in front of the Maryland politicians so that they can learn from it as well. So thank you all very much. It's greatly appreciated. I will mention very briefly for people who are on that we are going to post this to our video library. We need a couple of days for processing, but if you want to go back and check any information, you can do that once we've posted it. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Willdan. Thank you, Potomac Edison. Great session, and I hope everyone has a great remainder of their day. Thanks all. Bye.
Thank you so much, Sue. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.